Nearly 1.8 million people bought this car, and for years afterward, one phrase followed it everywhere: the one-car accident. That's not a nickname a company wants. That's the kind of line that ends careers, ends factories, ends a piece of American history almost overnight. Today we're talking about the Chevrolet Corvair, and I want to ask you something before we go any further. Was this car actually dangerous? Or did a young lawyer, a nervous corporation, and a United States Senate hearing turn an ordinary automobile into the most notorious car in American history? Stay with me, because what happened to the Corvair isn't really a story about a car, it's a story about power. About who gets believed, who gets buried, and what happens when a company decides the cheapest fix is silence. Let's go back to 1959. Chevrolet is preparing to launch something nobody in Detroit had tried before: an American compact car with the engine in the back. Air-cooled, like something you'd expect out of Europe, not out of General Motors. It was called the Corvair, and it hit showrooms for the 1960 model year. This wasn't some cheap afterthought. Engineers were proud of it. It had independent suspension on all four wheels, at a time when most American cars still rode on solid rear axles. For a company built on big steel and bigger engines, the Corvair was a genuine risk. A statement. Chevrolet was betting that American drivers were ready for something different. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because underneath that bold new design, something got quietly stripped away. A mechanic working on the Corvair's suspension, a man named George Caramagna, pushed hard for a stabilizer bar in the rear, a simple piece of hardware that helps keep a car planted through a hard turn. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't expensive, but GM management overruled him, left it out, called it unnecessary. Pay attention to that decision, because it's going to matter more than anyone at General Motors could have imagined in 1959. Without that bar, the Corvair depended on something most drivers never thought twice about: tire pressure. The front and rear tires needed different pressures, and those numbers didn't match what any tire manufacturer actually recommended. If an owner filled his tires the normal way, the way every gas station attendant in America had always done it, the car's handling changed, quietly, dangerously, and almost nobody knew. That's the setup. A radical new car, a cost-cutting decision buried in the fine print, and drivers who had no idea their tire pressure gauge could be the difference between a clean turn and a nightmare. But this is still just the beginning, because what happened next didn't stay quiet in an engineering department. It ended up on the evening news, in a courtroom, and eventually, in front of the United States Senate. Let's talk about what actually happens when a swing axle suspension goes wrong. Because this is the part almost nobody explained to Corvair owners back then, and it's the part that turned a clever piece of engineering into a genuine hazard. Picture the rear wheels of the Corvair. Instead of staying flat and upright through a hard turn, the way a modern car's wheels do, those swing axles could tilt, lean inward. Engineers call it tuck under. In plain language, the outside rear wheel could fold underneath the car during a sharp maneuver, and the whole rear end would suddenly lose its grip. One moment you're cornering. The next, the back of the car is trying to swap places with the front. Without that stabilizer bar the accountants had cut, and without perfect tire pressure that almost nobody maintained, this wasn't a rare freak occurrence. It was a known weakness, sitting quietly in driveways across the country. And then, in 1962, it stopped being theoretical. Ernie Kovacs was one of the most beloved television comedians in America, sharp, inventive, adored by audiences who'd never seen comedy quite like his. In January of that year, he was driving home from a party in Los Angeles, late at night, in the rain. He lost control of his car on a turn. It rolled. He was killed, almost instantly. Now, we have to be careful here. Not every account agrees on exactly what caused that crash, and grief and legend have a way of blending together over the decades, but the timing mattered. A famous man was dead, and the car in the headlines was a Corvair. The public didn't need an engineering report to feel uneasy. They just needed a name they recognized. And here's what makes this sting even more. The Corvair wasn't some obscure flop. Priced under $2,000, Chevrolet was selling around $200,000 a year through the early 60s. A mainstream car, sitting in driveways in nearly every town in America. That's why the controversy landed so hard. This wasn't a niche import. It was everywhere. By the early 1960s, lawsuits were already piling up. Owners who'd flipped their Corvairs in ordinary turns. Families who wanted answers. GM was quietly settling cases, quietly hoping the whole thing would fade. This is the part nobody in Detroit likes to admit. The controversy didn't start with a book. It started with real people, in real cars, on real roads, years before anyone outside the industry had ever heard the name Ralph Nader. But then, in November of 1965, that changed. A 31-year-old lawyer, mostly unknown, published a book that would take everything simmering quietly in courtrooms and lawsuits and put it directly in front of the American public. And once that happened, there was no putting it back. That book had a title that still gets quoted today, Unsafe at Any Speed, and its very first chapter had one target, one car, ours. The first chapter of Unsafe at Any Speed was called The Sporty Corvair, the one-car accident. Read that title again. Nader wasn't accusing another driver, another car, bad weather, or bad luck. He was saying the Corvair itself was the danger, that you didn't need a second vehicle involved. The car alone could kill you. Inside that chapter, Nader laid out the swing axle problem in detail, the missing stabilizer bar, the tire pressure numbers that didn't match what any manufacturer recommended. He argued that General Motors knew about the handling issues and chose not to fix them, because fixing them cost money and slowed down production. To him, this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. A choice made in a boardroom, paid for later on the highway. The book didn't stay in bookstores. It became a sensation. Newspapers picked it up. Radio hosts debated it. And in early 1966, Nader was invited to testify before a United States Senate subcommittee on auto safety, chaired by Senator Abraham Ribikoff. Overnight, a lawyer nobody had heard of a year earlier became the face of the American consumer. Now, before we go into what General Motors did next, and trust me, it gets worse, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to dig up stories like this, the ones that get flattened into a single sentence in a textbook. If you want more of the real history behind the cars, the companies, and the people involved, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And if this story's got you thinking already, drop a comment telling me what stood out to you so far. All right, let's keep going. Because here's where General Motors made its second, and far bigger, mistake. Instead of responding to Nader's criticism with engineering, with data, with a public defense of its own product, General Motors responded with something else entirely, surveillance. In early 1966, while Nader was preparing to speak in front of Congress, GM quietly hired private investigators to dig into his personal life, not his engineering claims, not his data, his life. They followed him. They questioned people who knew him about his political views, his habits, his personal relationships. According to later testimony, women were sent to approach him, apparently hoping to catch him in a compromising situation that could be used to discredit him publicly. Think about that for a second. One of the largest, most powerful corporations on earth had just been publicly criticized by a private citizen, and its answer wasn't to prove him wrong. It was to try and ruin him. It didn't work. It backfired in a way General Motors never saw coming. On March the 22nd, 1966, the surveillance campaign blew up in the most public way imaginable, a Senate hearing room in Washington, packed, television cameras rolling. Reporters lined up out the door, and sitting at the witness table, under oath, was James Roche, president of General Motors, the most profitable corporation on the planet at that time. Senator Ribikoff didn't go easy on him, neither did Senator Robert Kennedy, who was also on that committee. They pressed Roche again and again. Did GM hire investigators to follow Ralph Nader? Did they question his friends about his personal life? Did they attempt to entrap him? Roche admitted it, piece by piece. on live television, in front of the entire country. And then came the moment that made front pages coast to coast the very next morning. James Roche, president of General Motors, looked at Ralph Nader, sitting right there in that hearing room, and apologized. On the record, in front of cameras, he said he wanted to apologize, here and now, to the subcommittee and to Nader personally. Picture what that meant in 1966. This wasn't some junior executive issuing a quiet statement. This was the head of General Motors, one of the most powerful men in American industry, publicly humbled by a private citizen and a Senate committee. The newspapers didn't hold back. One headline the next day read simply, "GM's Goliath bows to David." The story writes itself. Corporate giant tries to crush the little guy, gets caught, gets forced to kneel in public. That's not just bad press. That's the kind of moment that changes laws. And it did. Less than 6 months later, on September the 9th, 1966, President Lyndon Johnson signed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act into law. For the first time in American history, the federal government had direct authority to set mandatory safety standards for every car sold in the country. Collapsible steering columns, shatterproof windshields, seat belts as standard equipment, not an option nobody bought. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Nader wasn't finished either. In 1970, General Motors settled a lawsuit with him over the surveillance, paying him $425,000. He used that money to build an entire network of consumer advocacy organizations that still exist today. So by every measure, it looked like the story was over. The villain exposed, the reformer victorious, the dangerous car defeated. Except that's not quite where this ends, because there's a detail that almost never makes it into the retelling, and it changes the entire picture. Here's the detail. In 1965, before Nader's book had even reached bookstore shelves, General Motors had already redesigned the Corvair. The second-generation model, introduced for the 1965 model year, replaced the swing-axle rear suspension entirely with a proper independent design, similar in principle to what Chevrolet's own Corvette used. The tuck-under problem, the exact flaw at the heart of Nader's first chapter, had already been engineered out of the car months before his book became a national story. Let that sink in. Nader's specific allegations applied to the 1960 through 1963 models. By the time the country was watching James Roche apologize on television, the car being criticized in the headlines hadn't existed in that form for over a year. And it wasn't just fixed. By the mid-1960s, Chevrolet was even building a turbocharged version, the Corsa, capable of real performance that had nothing to do with the sluggish economy car people pictured when they heard the name Corvair. Owners who drove the redesigned cars talked about sharp, confident handling, not danger. The car General Motors was defending itself over in that Senate hearing room, and the car actually rolling off the assembly line by 1966 were, in every meaningful sense, two different machines. And here's something that almost never makes it into the story either. The Corvair wasn't the only car on the road with a swing-axle rear suspension. Volkswagen's Beetle used one. So did early Porsches. So did certain Mercedes-Benz models. It was a common European design of that era, not some reckless American shortcut. Critics have pointed out for years that Nader's first chapter zeroed in on one specific American car, while similar suspension designs on other manufacturers barely got the same level of scrutiny. Interestingly, Nader's own organization did eventually take aim at the Volkswagen Beetle too, in a later report, but by then, the Corvair had already absorbed almost all of the attention and all of the damage. So was General Motors uniquely reckless, or just the company that got caught first and got caught loudest? That question matters, because what happens next depends entirely on the answer. There's a second half to this detail, the part that took even longer to surface. In 1971, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the very agency born out of this controversy, conducted a formal series of handling tests, comparing the 1963 Corvair against several of its contemporaries. The findings were published in a government report dated August the 12th, 1972. The conclusion: the Corvair's handling in sharp turns and its rollover rate were comparable to other cars of its era, not dramatically worse, comparable. The car that had been branded the one-car accident, that had ended a corporate president's public reputation for a day, that had helped birth a federal safety agency, was found by that very agency to be no more dangerous than its competitors. But by 1972, none of that mattered anymore, because the Corvair was already dead. Production had ended 3 years earlier, in 1969. Here's the part that stings if you actually sit with it. Sales had been strong right up through the mid-1960s, with the redesigned model selling nearly 250,000 units in a single year, more than the Camaro would manage a couple of years later. But the damage to its reputation, from the lawsuits, from the book, from the headlines, had already been done in the public's mind, long before the fixed version ever had a fair chance to prove itself. By 1968, annual sales had collapsed to around 14,000 cars. Chevrolet pulled the plug the following year, closing out a run of nearly 1.8 million cars built across 2 very different generations. So, which is it? Was the Corvair a genuinely dangerous car that deserved every bit of scrutiny it received? Or was it a car that got fixed and then got killed anyway, because reputations don't care about engineering reports filed 3 years too late? Maybe the honest answer is both things can be true at once. The early Corvair had a real flaw, born from a cost-cutting decision nobody wanted to admit to. And the car that eventually paid the price for it wasn't even the same car anymore. Even people inside General Motors eventually admitted as much. Years later, John DeLorean, the former Chevrolet general manager who went on to build his own car company, said openly that he believed Nader's criticism had real merit. Not necessarily about the car being unfixable, but about the rigid, short-sighted culture inside General Motors that let a known problem sit on the shelf while the accountants counted their savings. So what do you actually take away from a story like this, 60 years later? Maybe it's this: a missing stabilizer bar, a cost-cutting call made by someone who never had to answer for it personally, turned into a chain reaction that reshaped how every car in America gets built. Collapsible steering columns, shatterproof glass, seat belts you don't even think twice about buckling. None of that was guaranteed. It took a flawed car, a determined young lawyer, a corporation's arrogant overreach, and a Senate hearing room full of cameras to force an entire industry to take safety seriously instead of treating it as a line item to be trimmed. And there's a second lesson buried in here too, one that's a little harder to swallow. Reputation moves faster than truth. The Corvair was quietly fixed in 1965. It was publicly exonerated in 1972, but the public's mind had already been made up years before either of those things happened. Once a car, a company, or a person gets branded, the correction almost never travels as far as the accusation did. That's not just a story about Detroit in the 1960s. That's still exactly how things work today. If you drove one of these back in the day, or if your father did, or if you just remember the name from the arguments it used to start at family dinners, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what part of this story surprised you most. Was it the missing stabilizer bar, the GM investigators, or that quiet 1972 report that came 3 years too late to save the car it was defending? If this kind of history is something you want more of, the real story behind the headlines, not the flattened textbook version, then subscribing to this channel means you'll be here for the next one. Hit that like button if you made it this far. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who'd appreciate it. And if you know somebody who had a Corvair, or somebody who still argues about Ralph Nader at the dinner table, send this their way. Let them see the whole picture, not just the one sentence everybody remembers. The Corvair didn't die because it was the most dangerous car on the road. It died because perception got there first, and the truth arrived too late to change anyone's mind. That's worth remembering. Next time a headline tells you exactly what to think, before all the facts are actually in. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.